Okay, good. Kate Nilafalcha, welcome everybody to Irish Granny Tarot, and a sincere, grateful welcome to our honored guest, Dr. Marcus Reaker. And we were just talking off the air here, and I was telling him how much I appreciated him coming and doing this, because I have tortured this poor man for 5 months. I have to tell you, I was getting worried there would be a knock on the door and the sheriff would have a restraining order. I was really concerned. So I very much appreciate you. And Dr. Rediker wrote our fabulous book that we covered, The Fearless Benjamin Lay. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. So quickly, I'd like to introduce his background, and then we'll get going here. So Dr. Rediker is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History for the University of Pittsburgh. He has been a research fellow in Paris, a curator at the Tate Museum, more about that later. He's a historian, a prolific author, a documentarian, a playwright, and I think most significantly for the purposes of my channel, a human rights activist. He has numerous academic awards. We won't even go through them. And an august body of work, including Slave Ship, great book, really a good book. Outlaws of the Atlantic, I won't lie, I haven't read it yet, but I plan on it. Villains of All Nations, and this is also about seafaring piracy, that sort of thing. And the Many-Headed Hydra, which we'll talk about, and the Amistad Rebellion, which they made the movie from your book.
No, I wrote the book against the movie.
Oh, I haven't seen the movie, mea culpa, but that's interesting. We'll have to dig into that a little bit. So I think most famously, I thought this book, The Amistad Rebellion, but then you did a documentary, The Ghosts of Amistad, which I watched. It's on YouTube. Everybody can find it. It's fascinating. I hope we'll get to talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, for our purposes, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, and then lately a play on Return of Benjamin Lay, which is really interesting. So I want to thank you. And before we start, I have some burning questions for you, okay? So my first question is, how often as a child were you a pirate for Halloween?
There are photographs to prove the point.
I knew it. I knew this could not be something that suddenly sprang out fully formed as an adult. I knew it had to be.
Well, pirates actually have this very intimate place in the lives of children. After Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island.
That's right.
Children's literature, and then a whole cottage industry of films and books and coloring books.
I remember reading The Swiss Family Robinson and being utterly terrified of the pirates. It was very effective. Yeah. So my other question for you is...
let me tell you a story. I once met a friend's wife who had said she had the ability to see people's auras, the sort of surrounding force field. And she took one look at me and said that I was very scary because I must have been a pirate.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah. Well, I have a friend who's a real friend of the channel. She's very well known in some circles on YouTube, who does see auras. And I always tell her not to look at me. Please, just don't even look at me. That black cloud, that's hanging over my head. That's a very interesting talent. Very, very interesting. So you have written so many books, and I was struck by something. 17 languages? Your books have been translated into 17 languages? Be honest. How many of those can you read?
Well, not very many. There's an old joke that a person who can speak 3 languages is trilingual. A person who can speak 2 languages is bilingual. And a person who can speak 1 language is an American.
I knew you were going to say that.
So, but I can read a bit in several other languages, but Some of these books have been published in languages that do not have the sort of Western alphabet that we're accustomed to. So Japanese, Korean. One of the graphic novels is coming out in a Thai edition very soon.
Oh,
So
isn't that interesting?
yeah,
And any African dialects?
no, the Amistad book has been published in Africa, but in a French edition, the language of the colonizer.
Well, of course, yeah,
But
yeah.
but I must say, the ManyHeaded Hydra just came out in Arabic
No kidding. Oh,
2 months
wow.
ago. So it is kind of a special thrill to see one of your books in a language that you can't understand.
Yeah, I imagine I was entertaining myself earlier this morning trying to guess how many languages you spoke and what they would be.
What did you
So I
get?
was thinking maybe French,
I can read a little French. I'm
maybe
better.
some German.
No,
No.
not really. Spanish is probably my best second language, and I can also speak a little Russian.
I was going to ask you about that. And then of course I thought, well, probably English, but that remains to be seen, right? Okay. So your background. Oh no, I have one more really good question for you. I don't want to skip this one. So when they make the movie of Benjamin Lay, because if they don't, there's something terribly wrong in Hollywood. But when they make the movie of Benjamin Lay, who is Robert De Niro going to play?
Good question. I just watched Robert De Niro in Killers of the Flower Moon yesterday.
Yeah, I just finished reading the book.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah.
I can do that now. Yeah. It's an interesting question about the film. There've been a lot of nibbles, and I think a number of people were hoping that they could convince Peter Dinklage to play Benjamin Lay. Peter Dinklage being probably the most famous dwarf actor
Cyrano, yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened yet, but I'm not without hope. We do have a tremendously gifted actor who played Benjamin Lay in the stage play that premiered in London this summer, a man named Mark Povinelli, a really first-rate actor who we thought was tremendously charismatic on the stage and who really embodied Benjamin Lay. My wife, Wendy Goldman, who's also a historian, has lived with Benjamin Lay for many years right now. And during the premiere of the play, she turned to me and she said, "That's really Benjamin down there." And what that meant was that Mark Povinelli had embodied the person that she had come to know.
Sort of channeling the character of the
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Because that's difficult, I imagine, when you're casting any sort of on theatrical work and you have already a vision of who these characters are. It must be very difficult.
Well, it's complicated because you have in theater, you have the author's vision, and I co-wrote this play with Naomi Wallace, who is a really distinguished playwright. Then you have the director's vision, and you have the actor's vision. So you have many different visions that you have to reconcile.
Well, I'm assuming that Benjamin Lay himself would have some influence over the whole thing. So
Benjamin looms very large in many people's imagination, and it was really important that as a historical figure, Benjamin Lay meant a lot personally to our actor, Mark Povinelli. Mark is himself a little person and an activist. During the time the play was running, he was serving as president of this very large organization, Little People of America.
Oh.
And it really did matter to him that Benjamin Lay had done the things that he did, and yet he's not as well known as he needs to be.
Oh, we're going to talk about that. You better believe it. I think representation is important for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's long overdue. I think on television they've made some attempts and it's just been reprehensible, but that's another video, another day. So your background, I make these terrible mistakes of inviting people on, and then about 10 minutes before we're ready to video, I realized, oh, I should really introduce them. And I look into their background, and then, oh my God, I'm horrified at the enormous caliber and ubiquitous respect that a lot of these people like you receive. Some of them are well known, but I didn't know it because was that you?
Yes, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
good. No. That I was afraid I did something here in this delicate technological situation. Okay, so your background is so interesting, and I think it's probably accurate to say that there's some things in your past that directly inform where you are today. So I was noticing that your grandfather was a coal miner, that you spent a little bit of time at Vanderbilt, which you call a breeding ground for the Southern wealthy. I love it. That you worked at a cellophane factory for 3 years where there was a lot of racial tension. But what I read about it said that it led you to read books. That's a very good thing. And fourth of all is the time you spent in Russia. And I'm thinking that those things combine to bring you to a place of activism. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I do think that, my family is a working class family. My grandfather was a miner and a master storyteller. I like to think that I learned a lot from him. I think also very big influence for me was the generational one of the movements of the 60s and 70s, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement. And
I was just going to say, don't forget.
and this is really important because these movements all demanded a new kind of history, a new, more inclusive kind of history, a history that took, for example, slavery seriously, a history that took imperialism seriously, a history that took into account the larger part of humankind, women. And this is the kind of history that I do. I call it history from below.
That's right. Yeah.
History of people who are normally left out of the historical narratives, the sort of top-down great men narratives. And my view is that these ordinary working people make a lot of history. That we can learn a lot about why things happened when they did and how they did, and we can take some inspiration
Well,
from.
we know who started the French Revolution, and it wasn't the king. You're
No,
absolutely right. We're looking in the wrong direction. Yeah.
we are, or as we might put it, looking through the wrong end of the spyglass.
Oh, that's a good way. That's very piratical.
These things come naturally to me.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. I feel like you're maybe correct me if I'm wrong, your sense of social justice is sort of led you to your interest in seamen, sailors, pirates, and you just mentioned it, but you talked quite a bit about the history from below and Terracentrism. Thought that was an interesting term. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I started my career as a scholar in graduate school studying sailors, 18th century sailors and pirates. And
let me interrupt you. How did you land there? How did you pick that?
Well, okay, here's it's a crooked path, as many scholarly paths are. When I got to graduate school in 1976, I wanted to do history from below. That much I knew. There was a group of historians in England, led by someone named E.P. Thompson, very famous historian who wrote a book called The Making of the English Working Class. And they were studying the history of working people through legal records. Because, one of the problems of trying to study this kind of history is that poor people don't leave many records of their own. So you have
often not literate, often not property owners. Yeah.
Exactly. So I wanted to find a topic where I could use legal records to reconstruct the social world of working people who were somewhat unknown. And I decided that pirates would be the group to study because they generated tremendous amounts of legal documentation. Court
and wars.
Yeah. Pamphlets, correspondence, government reports. Pirates produced a lot of documentation. And so the very first research project I did was on pirates in the early 18th century. And when I had finished working on them, I published an article on them in 1981. I realized that I needed to go back now and study the whole maritime world of work that they came from. And so that's when I wrote my dissertation about that. And that became my first book, called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, about sailors in the early 18th century.
That's fascinating. I mentioned, your interest in pirates to somebody, and I was saying something about, the shores of Tripoli, and it really didn't know what I was talking about. I think it's a portion of American history that's just really overlooked.
I think it is. I think it is, like so much of maritime history. And to come back to your question about terracentrism, I'm sorry I got off the track there.
Oh, no. That's the style here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, here's what I kept wondering. Why is it that most people can't see what happens at sea? There's a kind of sea blindness. Sailors didn't really figure in the histories of the time. It seemed like the sea was a kind of ahistorical void, and the assumption was that history only happens on land. So I wrestled with this idea for a long time, and then finally, probably 20 years or more after I first started doing this kind of maritime history, I came up with a word to describe it.
It's a great word, yeah.
And that word is terracentrism.
Yep.
It means land-based history. But it also means that you are blinded to the things that happen at sea. For example, class formation happens at sea. Race formation happens at sea. Cultural formation happens at sea. And if you just use the nation state as your instrument of investigation, you miss all these other things. So my life as a scholar has been all about trying to recover those lost histories at sea.
Well, it's ironic because if you think about it, when I think about it, I always think of the history of the countries around the Mediterranean as sort of an ocean-going cultural exchange, right? But I never think of the United States in those terms. However, I was born in Ireland, it's an island, and my grandfather, you'll be happy to hear, was a maritime engineer. He was a marine engineer for the Irish fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
So he spent most of his life in a boat at sea.
Mm.
He was in St. Petersburg when it was St. Petersburg the first time. He was in China. I mean, he went all over the world.
Yeah.
Really interesting. And my big regret is that he died when I was too young to really pick his brain.
Yes, I understand.
I would love to have done that.
Yeah.
But anyway, now see, constantly veering off the path here.
Well, you know what William Blake said?
Well, he said a lot.
He said the crooked paths are always the best paths.
Well, depends. Depends on whose crooked path we're talking about. There's some pretty scary ones going on right now. So I was really struck. I didn't realize this about you. I knew about the academics. I knew about the topics that you were interested in, but I didn't understand your commitment to social justice and human rights. And one of the best stories I read about you was your relationship with the Tate Museum. Cracked me up. Would you talk a little bit about Turner's painting and how that became a performance art for you?
Yes. In 2017, I agreed to work as a guest curator at Tate Britain in London. And the specific charge that I had was to work in the JMW Turner Gallery and to provide a new history from below angle, excuse me, that would help museum goers to understand Turner's work in new ways. And so I set about this work, and I came up with two themes based on the collected works of Turner that they have at Tate Britain, and they have a lot of them. He left about 300 paintings to the British government when he died. And so one of the themes was unfree labor. Turner did a very famous painting of a slave ship. This actually hangs in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But he did another very interesting painting, which depicts the wreck of a convict ship on the way from London to Australia that was that had 100 and I think it was 112 women on board, women and their children.
Well, I've got it written down here. It's 108 women and 12 children.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make this history part of the museum exhibition. And there were several things I wanted to do. I wanted to talk about Turner's knowledge of the shipwreck. The shipwreck was a very big deal. It was a scandal, a public scandal, because the captain could have allowed the women to be taken ashore by French sailors during the storm. They were caught in a storm, and it was very clear they were going to wreck. And some French sailors very courageously rowed out to the vessel to take people on board to save their lives. The captain refused to let them go because he knew these women would run away, which in fact they probably would have done.
What a nightmare.
Yeah, and the captain paid for this message, this error, with his own life, because he was also killed in the shipwreck. But anyway, Turner was very moved by this. He painted this painting of women clutching at their children as a broken off piece of the ship is going down. I found it very moving. And I wanted this exhibition to, in a sense, be a memorial to these women. And so I investigated a lot of things about this the shipwreck. And one thing I discovered was that the women on board the vessel were very unruly. They were quite rebellious. The crew had a very hard time dealing with them. So what the captain did was what other convict ship captains did. He had a black box built on the main deck of the ship. It was a punishment box in which the leaders of this rebellious group of women would be placed one at a time and forced to stand there for long periods. You can't sit down, you can't lie down. And so I thought this was a really interesting symbol of the resistance of these women, that it spoke to their agency. It spoke to kind of their willingness to fight back against oppressive circumstances. And I happened to find, with the help of a friend in Australia, a surviving black box. It's in a museum in Tasmania, in Hobart. This was built by one of the captains for unruly women. And so I approached the people at Tate Britain about using this box as part of the exhibition. And they were initially quite favorable about the idea. But as the time to open the exhibition drew near, they grew increasingly worried about it. They thought that it was going to be too shocking. They thought that it was, it made the history a little too real, actually.
What I read was they called it a domineering presence.
Well, they were afraid. They were afraid that the power of this symbol, the black box, was going to overwhelm Turner's painting. And I thought there was a great dynamic tension between the painting and the black box.
That's the purpose of it.
Yeah, exactly. So I felt that that they finally, the leadership of Tate Britain finally said that they would not allow me to use the black box. And I resigned in protest, saying that this was censorship of my work, of my ideas for this exhibition. With great sadness, I resigned.
I was so impressed about your action, because not everybody has the courage of his or her conviction. It's rare to find people that are willing to sacrifice the bragging rights, the position for something that really is much more important in the larger scale of, humanitarian human history. So, am I the only one here who's making a connection between this and Florida's laws about critical race theory? We'll have to talk about that in a minute. So you've been a vocal supporter for reparations for slavery. I find that enormously impressive, because not least because it's not a popular position in a lot of circles. And I'm kind of curious about your take on education, and specifically historical education or the lack thereof, and just how you feel about how young it should start, how real it should be. Do you think that if education, our historical education, were better, that it would change people's views on reparation? If we could somehow make the history, as you did at the Tate, more real, more three-dimensional, more personal?
Yeah. I got into this line of work, becoming a historian, because I wanted to research and write and teach a new kind of history, and a more honest history, a more truthful history, about not just the history of the winners, the Thomas Jeffersons of the world, but the history of everybody. This thing about history from below, it's it includes everybody. Everybody counts. So there's been, and I want to emphasize that, my generation of historians, people who were all like myself, affected by the movements of the 60s and 70s, have written magnificent work in recovering these lost histories. And in particular, one of the greatest bodies of research done anywhere in the world over the last 50, 60 years is the work on slavery, the history of slavery. Now, there remains a terrible disconnect between what scholars know about slavery and what the general public know about slavery. And this, of course, means that historians need to be working much more with teachers to make the best of their scholarship available. But now we see that there are some people who don't want to know the truth.
Yeah.
Some people who don't want to admit that the institution of slavery, let's just talk about the United States, the institution of slavery is absolutely central to American history. The wealth of the nation is
That's
a
right.
great deal of it is a function of slavery, unpaid labor for 12 generations.
The success of the colonies was built on the backs of the unpaid labor of
Truly.
kidnapped people and the
Yes.
genocide and theft of property of
Yes,
Native
definitely.
Americans. Has to be said, and it has to be said really clearly. And look at me. I don't have a vested familial interest, but I come from a country where this resonates. I'm
Definitely.
hearing an echo of things that were familiar in my family. You heard of the ghost ships from Ireland during the famine, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So people, I talk about the same thing all the time. I have 3 favorite topics that just cycle through here.
Yeah, no,
That's
that's
one of
very
them.
important and certainly crucial to Irish history, because
Human history.
the poor Irish were major components of building the plantation system in the early days. But to come back to your question about how this education can happen, let me
Yeah.
tell you a personal story. My daughter went to a mixed race elementary school, public school here in Pittsburgh, and I was invited by her teacher when she was around 10 years old to come and give a presentation on slavery. And I thought long and hard about what can 10-year-olds really understand about slavery? What would be appropriate for them to try to take on board? So I ended up talking about a historical figure named Alauda Equiano, who was an Igbo child.
In your slave ship book.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
chapter about him. He was from what's present day Nigeria. And at the age of 10, he was captured and taken aboard a slave ship. So I told these children the story of Alauda Equiano. And what happened in the course of that was just kind of magical, because they saw that he was the same age as they were.
Yeah.
And so they really, they identified with
Yeah.
story, and they really took it on board. So I think if we find the right ways to teach this really difficult history, then it's something that we should certainly try to do. And there are a lot of historians who've been trying to do this now
Yeah.
for many years.
Yeah.
So this is an ongoing battle.
Well, I believe it's our responsibility. We're obligated. It's our moral responsibility. And I'll tell you a little story. Do you remember the old Time Life hardback books they sold in grocery stores?
Sure.
Well, when I was about 9 or 10, the local grocery store had a series of them on American history, and I tortured my poor mother. You know, I think they were 89 cents or something. And I'd get one every couple of weeks or so. And I remember vividly, and I think you have the picture in this book, if I'm not mistaken, of the layout of the slave ship and the people head to toe, like kernels of corn on a cob, kind of. And I remember just being horrified. However, not emotionally scarred. It opened my eyes to human history. I think we do our kids a disservice when we overprotect them from reality. They're part of the human race too, and they need to know. So I love that story. That's a beautiful story. And of course it would resonate. How do you think they taught the Titanic? Nice, non-controversial topic. When they did the traveling exhibit, you got the name of a victim and you got to be, of course, it personalizes it. So the other topic that I was fascinated by your involvement with is capital punishment. Also, not the world's most favorite topic to talk about. How did you get involved in? And I don't think I need to say that you're against capital punishment.
I'm definitely against. For many years I was very active in the movement, and basically my commitment is that we can't allow the government to kill us. That that is not a right that governments have. And when you look at the history of executions, these have been used to suppress all kinds of hopes for positive change. Think of the enslaved rebels who were executed. Excuse me, the book you mentioned, The ManyHeaded Hydra, is full of executions, and the pirates were executed by the hundreds. And so I felt as though this was a really important issue that we needed to think about. And here's one way I always try to explain the issue to people when I gave talks on the death penalty. And I gave one talk at a Black church in Pittsburgh. Was invited by a well-known African-American judge. And so I posed this question to him and the people in his church. Let's suppose that you've been charged with first-degree murder and you're facing the possibility of execution. Just imagine that that's happened, however unlikely. Imagine that's happened. In that circle.
Oh, I don't know. I've been married 43 years. I imagine it every day. Sorry.
Okay. So in that situation, would you rather be rich and guilty or poor and innocent? And everybody says, I'd rather be rich and guilty. And when I posed this question, the judge blurted out, rich and guilty. I know how this system works. And so if you think that being rich and guilty increases your likelihood of escaping capital punishment as opposed to someone who is poor and innocent, you've got to oppose the death penalty.
Where's the justice?
Yeah.
Right.
And that is actually a truth that everybody understands. Even I think everybody understands that there is this very basic unfairness built into the system. And a lot of people
deny that.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. It's controversial. Yeah. But that's been my experience of activism on this. And I find that we're winning.
That's heartening to hear.
No,
I did a book a few months ago called Kings, Conquerors, and Psychopaths. And it's historical overview of all the tyrants in the world, basically, and equating them, eventually drawing us into corporate psychopathy.
Right.
But it talks a lot about these terrible leaders, especially in ancient history, who would line 4,000 people up and behead them in one day. You know, that is the ultimate power of authority, the ultimate tyrannical control.
Right.
And just because it's done on a one-to-one doesn't mitigate the evil of it, I don't believe.
It does not. It definitely does not. But the number of executions has gone down over the years. Juries are less likely to convict in death penalty cases. More and more states are putting de facto moratoria or outright bans on the death penalty. So I think we're winning on this subject.
Well, remember that black cloud I was telling you about earlier?
Mhm.
We now have a candidate for president who thinks that all people convicted of drug dealing or whatever should be executed. And let's just eliminate that long process. It's just a
Right.
waste of time and money. Let's just take them out back and deal with them on the same day. I think that terrifies me. Okay, let's change the subject. So tell me if I'm pronouncing this correctly. The Lernaean Hydra, Lernaean?
That's
Okay.
correct.
From Greek mythology. I thought this was such an interesting metaphor. And then when I found out that it was created by business people and leaders, the irony of that. So this informed your book that you wrote about it, but it's larger topic of corporate control and the history of that. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The reference here is to this book I wrote called The Many-Headed Hydra, wrote with Peter Linebaugh, The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. And what we discovered was that the ancient myths of Greece and Rome, especially the myth of Hercules, the conquering hero, and the Lernaean Hydra, the many-headed Hydra, in which every time Hercules cut off a head, two new heads grew in its place. So this was a metaphor that the rulers of the English Empire began to use very early on. And it's true, actually, other imperial powers used it too. And what the ruling class of the day would do was depict themselves as Hercules, trying to discipline this rowdy, unruly, motley crew of workers to build this system of capitalism. And so this metaphor was quite brutal and deadly, and it predicted, major executions. And of course, those happened repeatedly. But for us in doing this work, we find this reference everywhere. I mean, once you become aware of it, yeah, it's kind of everywhere. And we were finding all these references in the era before the keyword search engine. So imagine how many we could have found if we had been doing this project more recently. But I think the key point here is that there is an effort to discipline workers, to make them do the work of ship and plantation and factory, but that those people fight back. They have their own resistance. They grow new heads of resistance. And so this seemed to us to be a really apt summary for the metaphor and concept, actually, not just the metaphor, but a concept for understanding the origins of the modern world.
I think there's a very frightening narrative going on right now about the potential of rounding up illegals, people without documents, which used to be the equivalent of a parking ticket, and rounding them up, putting them into camps. And then how will those be administered? Well, they'll put them to work for free. I believe this is a sly, underhanded attempt to achieve free labor, is what I'm thinking. And when's the last time we saw that happen? Very, very strongly illustrated for us. It's happened before since, but the Holocaust, right?
Yes. And of course, this goes back once again, like so many other things, to the roots of slavery and the chain gangs and the vagrancy laws that free people of color were convicted of breaking after the Civil War.
Yeah.
I grew up in the South, and I remember these all black chain gangs working on
Yeah.
the side of the
Oh
road
man.
for free.
Man.
So this is a powerful image, and I do think you're right to see that continuity.
You're from Kentucky?
I was born in Kentucky, and I grew up in Tennessee and Virginia, so upper
Okay. So Huntsville is in Alabama.
Alabama,
Now
right?
Huntsville is like a city of its own, isn't it? I mean, they have a real economy going, and I think they still have black inmates picking cotton for free. For free.
I think that goes on in several places.
Just horrified. I just anyway. Never mind.
The past is with us, or as Faulkner said, the past isn't dead; it isn't even past.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. That's so true. So let's get to the man of the hour here, Benjamin Lay. And I do not understand. Well, very quickly, Benjamin Lay, a living stick of dynamite. I love that. He was a performance artist, a vegan, an environmentalist, an anti-smoker. He was into animal rights because he was a follower of Pythagoras, who said, as long as men massacre animals, they will kill each other. Interesting. He was pro-women's equality, pro-free libraries, anti-capitalist. He thought the rich were the devil's most effective instrument of evil, and a performance artist par excellence. But tell me why you don't think he was a proto-hippie or a proto-progressive. He's like the Diggers, the Diggers of the
Very
60s
much
in
so.
San Francisco, right?
Absolutely. And, as you know, because you've summarized the book very well,
Oh, thanks.
the fearless Benjamin Lay argues that the radical groups who came out of the English Revolution, the 1640s and 1650s, they're called levelers, diggers. This is where the San Francisco group got their name.
Yep.
Ranters, seekers, and Quakers. Quakers were very radical in those days.
I
Quakers,
always assumed Quakers were radical, and then I was shocked to read about the Quakers of colonial Pennsylvania because they're the opposite.
well, Quakers have gotten very respectable now, and they still have, many progressives within their congregations. But back in the 1650s, they were wild.
Yeah.
And Benjamin Lay took over some of that wildness and harnessed it to the cause of anti-slavery. So he would, your viewers, I'm sure, would be interested to know, do things like sprinkle fake blood on the bodies of Quaker slave owners to humiliate them in public. And
I think the movie should start with that scene in the meeting where he stabs the book. Yes. I love telling people about that. It's dramatic, and it was very consequential, which we'll talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Benjamin Lay had a tremendous impact among the Quakers, who became the first group to outlaw slavery within their own ranks. And then they played subsequently a very large role in the growth of an anti-slavery movement.
And I think significantly, he had the biggest impression on the children.
He loved children. He spoke to children all the time. And we're back to our theme of teaching progressive history to children. Yes. He thought this was very important. And I just might add, one of the reasons why I wrote this play with Naomi Wallace was because Benjamin was so theatrical.
Yeah.
He really did perform his ideas in public.
He would do things like go to the women's meetings and disrupt them just with questions, but the presence of a man and speaking out. He would lie down in front of the church door to make them have to walk over his body as a symbolic act, And I loved how he broke all the teapots, the China service in the main, what's it called? Like the quad or the main area.
Market.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm still quarantining. I forget what the world is called. And going to the wealthy Quakers slave owners' houses and having been invited and going to the door, and as soon as he planned ahead, as soon as he saw that they were slave owners, he'd see a black slave servant. He'd make a big production out of it and accuse them of being abominations. And I just love some of the stuff he said. Let's see, what did he say? Oh, the rich are the devil's most effective instrument of evil. I think that's wonderful. What else did he say here? Well, I guess that's all I wrote down. I loved how this book was written. I mean, the topic, the subject matter is fascinating, but I love your style. Your narrative style is just beautiful. Really, really draws you in. I was rooting for him from the very beginning.
Right.
So, why isn't he taught in school? I've never heard of him, and I pride myself in being fairly well read.
Yes. You know, I can't tell you how many hundreds, if not thousands of times I've entertained that question since I began working on Benjamin Lay. And
well, I'm reading your mind.
well, a lot of people are really indignant that they haven't heard of him.
Oh yeah,
It's
exactly.
infuriating. I got, for example, before the book came out, I published an op-ed about Benjamin Lay in the New York Times, and I got a flood of email, including a lot of people from the small town in Pennsylvania where he lived,
Never heard.
Abington, and they said we hadn't heard of him either. How could this possibly happen? Well, okay, here's the reason. First of all, his fellow Quakers disowned Benjamin for his anti-slavery radicalism.
On two continents.
That's right, on two continents, 4 different meetings kicked him out. He was the most disowned Quaker of the 18th century. I'm sure that was a matter of a badge of honor, we might
That's
say.
right.
So they wanted to suppress his voice. They wanted to take away his ministry. He saw this as a ministry. And then I think even more influentially, Benjamin Lay didn't fit the story that historians have always told about the abolitionist movement. The idea here is that the abolition movement grew from the Enlightenment and from gentlemen, middle and upper class gentlemen who basically had this sort of enlightened ideal that slavery was wrong. Well, look, the people who really understood that slavery was wrong were the enslaved. They are always the first abolitionists. But then along comes Benjamin Lay, and he's from the wrong class, right? He's not a gentleman. He's not really formally part of the late 18th century Enlightenment. He's got the wrong body type. His methods are too extreme. And so let's just get rid of this guy. He doesn't fit the story. In fact, a leading historian of the abolitionist movement called Benjamin Lay a demented little hunchback.
Oh, I remember that.
I mean, that's some pretty violent rhetoric, right? That's violent rhetoric. So
derogatory and dismissive
yeah,
and arrogant.
so anyway, I have made it my life's purpose, or one of them anyway, to try to bring Benjamin Lay back to public memory in every way I can. And so I wrote the biography. I wrote a graphic novel with David Lester. I wrote a play with Naomi Wallace. I'm making a documentary film now.
Yeah.
With the same director who did The Ghosts of Amistad, a very eminent local filmmaker here in Pittsburgh, Tony Buba.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
You know what you need to do? Not that you're not busy. You need to do a children's book.
I have a children's book that I've co-written, and we're searching for a publisher right now. So that is another way of reaching people with this inspiring story.
If you need a letter of recommendation, let me know. I think he's the greatest American hero no one's ever heard of.
I think that's a very good way to put it. And he does embody, I think, the best American values. All those things that you mentioned before, opposition to every kind of oppression, animal rights, vegetarianism. I mean, he really thought all of this through, and he had such a very radical worldview. Environmental justice was something that he was interested in. He said, "Beware rich men who poison the earth for gain." That's something that could have been said yesterday. He said this 300 years ago. So
he's an enlightened being. You know, they talk a lot about Gandhi and Buddha and Jesus. And Benjamin Lay said things of such weight and insight and awareness, at least on an equal with those characters. And they're revered, and he's completely ignored. It's not right.
It's not right, but we're trying to fix it. This podcast will fix it, help to fix it. But anyway, I do urge all of your viewers to make it a point to go out and learn something about Benjamin Lay. There are a lot
when I covered the book, it was an overwhelmingly positive response.
Oh,
people were just equal parts thrilled and horrified to hear the story.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you just a little tiny bit about the documentary.
Okay.
That was really interesting. Now I've got to set the scene here, give you some context. I don't camp. I don't like hikes. I don't like bugs and sweat. Now I walk every day. I'm not completely against going outside, but I don't understand why anyone would sleep on the ground. I always say when God created the world, she would not have invented waterbeds if she meant for us to sleep on the ground, you know? So I watched your documentary with horrified fascination. Those boats, I was like, oh my God, I can't watch. Those boats had like a bare drop of water before the water went over the tops. Oh my God. It was terrifying and it looked miserable. The history was fascinating, the oral history, the things that you discovered, fascinating, but you're intrepid.
Well, in this film that you're referring to, called Ghosts of Amistad, and as you mentioned, it's available online on YouTube.
On YouTube. Yeah.
We went to Sierra Leone to discover the roots of the famous Amistad uprising of 1839. And all of the people who were on board that vessel were from Sierra Leone. So we went there, and I had found in my research the villages that some of the people had come from. So we went to those villages and asked the elders if they had any memory of the Amistad case. And a couple had quite extensive memory of it. But the other part of our quest was to find the slave trading factory where everybody was incarcerated before they boarded the slave ship. And this was a place called Lomboko. And nobody had been able to find Lomboko for about 50 years. And every time we asked somebody about it, they would say, oh, it's underwater now. Oh, it's gone to bush. Oh, you can't find it. But we finally found someone who knew where it was.
Fishermen, two guys that were fishing,
fishermen,
right?
Yes,
right.
Fishermen from a small village on the south coast of Sierra Leone. And they took us in their dugout canoes to Lomboko.
Barely canoes.
Yeah,
Barely.
well, they had broken pieces and all the rest.
God.
But I remember once showing the film in Norfolk, Virginia, and we're leading up to the point where we're about to get into the canoe, and a woman sits behind me and says, "Don't get in that canoe. Whatever you do, don't do it." Oh, hell no, she said. But we were too full of purpose to miss the opportunity, and also we trusted the fishermen. This was their place in the world.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, this was their commons. I mean, there were alligators in the swamp. There were hippos in the river. Now, wait a minute, this is a really dangerous animal.
That's the most dangerous animal. More people are killed by hippos, I think, than any other animal. It's just phenomenal.
Except probably human beings, but we're the most dangerous animal. But anyway, we didn't.
We don't count.
we didn't know about the hippos, but we would have gone anyway because we assumed the fishermen would know how to deal with them.
But you were counting on the fact that they weren't fatalists or nihilists or something.
Right. Well, they were fishermen, and they had knowledge. They had local knowledge. So we went, as you saw in the film, through this extraordinary mangrove forest, you might call it, along the water. Just fascinating, chilling, eerie,
primeval.
And we got there. We found the place.
Yeah, you did. It was remarkable.
So it was successful, but we did have a strong sense of purpose in going there.
Well, I thought it was fascinating to watch the psychology at play. You're quite the diplomat. They should send you to a few places around the world right now. Be a very good diplomat. I'd be blurting things out. There's no way I could do what you did, because you could see on the faces of these elderly village people, the suspicion and the doubt about you and the fear, and you managed to quell all of that. There were a couple of quotes from the documentary. When an elder dies, a library burns down.
Mhm.
That was fascinating. And then if you want to hide something from an African, put it in a book. Because they have an oral tradition for the most part.
Mhm. Mhm.
And here were all these people who, the sons of the sons of the sons of the original
Mhm.
people traders. It's fascinating. So, what did I want to ask you about? I had a question. I forgot to write down my question about the people in the village. Oh, I know what it was. It seems self-evident. Were you ever concerned for your own safety?
Never. And here's why. Um, Several people in the aftermath of 9/11 noticed that Islamic prayers were said in one of the villages that we visited, and they thought that was scary. It wasn't the least bit scary. Uh, the main reason why is because our guide and our translator and our cultural broker, Tazif Karoma, uh, was a person of extremely great stature in the villages that we visited. He was a lecturer in linguistics at Fora Bay College. He spoke who knows how many different Sierra Leonean languages, and he was very greatly respected. So um, I really wasn't the diplomat, he was. And so he would translate our questions, uh, not only in terms of language, he would translate them culturally
Right,
to
right.
create a kind of question that the people could then answer.
With
And
with
so,
with uh with self-respect and not,
yes,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah, gotcha.
exactly. And so I think Tazif Karoma, who has passed away, I'm sorry to say, in the time since we made that film, is deserves tremendous credit for whatever success we had.
Well, it was really fascinating. I guess I didn't know what to expect when I started to watch it because, like I said, I had not watched the movie, the Hollywood movie. I knew basically in one sentence what it was about. It was just fascinating. There was another question I wanted to ask you about that. Now, darn, now that's gone out of my head too. It's kind of a vacuum and things get pulled out. And so I guess my last question is you work with young students all the time. You're still teaching, yes?
Yes.
I saw you doing the presentation. I think it was a church, an African American church, about your trip to Sierra Leone, and I believe it was students in the audience.
Quite
And
possible.
it really struck me that they were absolutely riveted. They were hanging on your every word, which is so encouraging. I'll tell you, this is my experience. I was walking down the street neighborhood the other day, and there was a young guy, probably about early 20s, cutting down a tree, and he had a big stack of logs, like a firewood, and all kinds of brush, and he was up to his eyebrows in the remains of this tree, and he was still working at it. So when I walked by, I said hi, and I said to him, I think I'm hilarious. I said, oh, I see you got your work cut out for you. And he says to me, and I quote, what do you mean? Oh God. Oh God. So convince me there's still cause for hope.
Oh, I think there's signs of hope everywhere. Even though the world seems to be spinning madly out of its orbit at times in these days, I think these are rather dark days. I take great hope in, for example, the big successful strike by the UAW.
Yes.
The UAW, I think, has regained its mantle as the source of progressive unionism in
Mhm.
this country. I think this could be inspiring and a lot of different things and a lot of different ways. And the other thing is, there are. I'll tell you something that Howard Zinn once
Mhm.
said,
Mhm.
the great people's history
Mhm.
specialist. He said, this was, some years ago before he passed away. He said, as I travel around the country, I think there are more people working in progressive causes now than there were at the peak of the movements of the 60s and 70s. But there's one big difference. They don't feel connected to each other now.
Yeah.
So that back in the old days, it was assumed that if you worked on the anti-war movement, you were also helping the women's movement. If you worked on the women's movement, then you're also helping a kind of broader progressive cause. And so everybody felt connected.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we've got to do now is connect the dots.
Well, it strikes me as, well, pardon the pun, it strikes me as part of the problem is we're lacking in unifying figures, strong leaders, which is why I think Sean Fain has a large
Yes.
debt of gratitude from people for the role he's taken. A most unprepossessing hero, you know, he doesn't seem like the strength of character that he seems to have. And I always want to call him after the Irish political party, Sinn Féin. That confuses me every time. So there aren't the figures like Bayard Rustin. I did Bayard Rustin's life during Black History Month, I think, or maybe it was Pride Month 2 years ago, and nobody had ever heard of him.
Yeah,
which was shocking.
There's a new documentary coming out on him very soon.
They can call me and thank me anytime. I'm sure that
But I agree. We need more unifying figures, but we also still need unifying ideas, especially ideas about history and how history from below can make breakthroughs and create new possibilities for people. I think it's important that we know the history. This is kind of where you started in this interview.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to know the history because we can take inspiration from it and see that another world is possible.
If you feel comfortable talking about this at all, what do you think about the reaction against the 1619 Project?
Well, I think it's I have a somewhat complicated reaction to that project because
I thought you would. Isn't that funny?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that it's a really valuable piece of work. It's a really valuable project. It has made a huge change in the way people think about the past. It's really crucial. One thing that bothers me is that historians have been doing this kind of work for 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
And along come many journalists who sort of jump in front of the parade. And I didn't feel like the work that had gone into this patient excavation of the history got the credit.
Right. For the depth of work and the time of work. Exactly. But, you know, I think that's a statement on the impact that journalism and specifically the visual media have on what we know and the news that's considered important. And
no, I think I just wish that there's so many really excellent historians who don't write for a popular audience. I really wish that historians would do more to educate the general public and not just write for other specialists, because that's the way to close that gap.
Yeah.
What the scholars know and what the general public knows.
Well, there are a couple of, I know one is a historian, the other one I'm assuming, books that I've done on my channel here that are, I believe, historical works. American Compromise by Craig Unger,
yes.
which of the influence of, you know, Russia, which you know about, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book, Strong Men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're readable, they're entertaining, they have a flow. American Compromise is like some sort of spy movie. It's fascinating.
Some people have a great gift for it, and I just think it's really important as almost a civic obligation to write for as broad an audience as one can.
You can get a little bit too much into the weeds and into your own head when you're an academic, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, I have a daughter who was doing graduate work in English history, English women's history, and she got her master's, and then she said, I can't spend the rest of my life doing whatever these people are doing. I can't.
Well, you need to learn that about yourself.
Yeah. Well, she's happy now doing something else, but big expert on Jane Austen.
Good. I'll stay with her.
A good judge of psychology and human behavior, that's for sure. Well, I think that's basically all the questions I had for you, and I'm so grateful that you didn't report me to the authorities for torturing you. And it's been so much fun. I so appreciate it.
I enjoyed it myself, so thank you for the invitation.
Well,
Thank
hurry up and write another book so I can have you back.
Okay, I'm working on it as we speak.
Make me a promise that when your next documentary comes out, we'll do this again.
We'll do it again.
Oh, I would be delighted. And I know that we're going to get lots and lots and lots of positive feedback about this conversation.
Sure.
So, Marcus, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to meet you. I was worried. I thought you'd be just... So thank you very, very much.
Okay.
It was most gracious and very entertaining, and I've learned a lot. And I hope we'll do it again soon.
Okay.
So thank you, everybody, for watching, and slunga foil, slancha.